Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Lent studies. These series of talks are based on the book by Hannah Steele called Living His Story. It encourages us to look at the scary process called evangelism and simply sharing everyday stories of our lives to reveal the extraordinary love of God in ordinary ways. The first week, George reminded us that sharing these stories is based on sharing the greatest story of all time, the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, a story that gave hope to the world that things can change. Next, Alan pointed out that when it comes to sharing stories, we are not alone. We join with God as we share these stories. Margaret spoke of how Jesus was in the transformation business and how our own stories can help people to see that transformation is real. Margaret also gave us some practical tips for Lent that show us that this transformation in practice helps others. But it still doesn't seem easy, does it? Just how do we go about sharing our stories? People love to hear stories. We have them everywhere in our lives: social media, newspapers, magazines, and even on TV. All of us have stories to share, but often we think that we don't have the skills to share them. Well, I can tell you now that you do. Remember, we are joining with God to share these stories that sprout from sharing stories of change. But before you start, it's important to be prepared. Think of what you might say in advance if someone's to ask you how or why you joined the church. Yours might not be as dramatic as the stories we read of in these Christian books, but nonetheless, it's a story of God's grace and presence, a gradual realization of the importance of God in your life, or how you got to church, is just as important. It's an equally valid story to share. So, have an idea of what you might say to someone who asks you how or why you're involved in the church. Remember that being prepared gives you more time to listen and be attentive to the questions asked. Being prepared with a story is a great start, but you must remember too that the story needs to be accessible. It can be difficult for us to remember the words that we're familiar with as Christians can sound odd or unfamiliar to people who are unfamiliar with the Christian faith. Try to make it accessible to all. And when it comes to sharing your story of how God has worked in your life, those stories are unique to you. So remember, you must share them honestly. Don't pretend to be someone else. Remember, we're not claiming to have all the answers, but we are offering to share what we have found Jesus to be true. He's real, forgiving, and transformative in our lives. Sharing with someone is not about claiming definitive proof, but it's about saying that we have found something extraordinary and we want to share it with you. Be honest about the struggles as well as the high points. Honest about not being perfect. Sharing our stories with others, yes, it's a privilege, but it's a huge responsibility too. Remember, the disciples centered their testimony entirely on Jesus' death and his resurrection. Rowan Williams describes Easter as the one focal interpretive story of Jesus. We understand who Jesus is because he is the one who is risen from the dead, and we understand ourselves in response to that story. We live because Jesus lives. So our story should always point to Jesus as the one who makes sense of who we are and how we live. And remember, we never know how God will use our story in someone else's life. So be bold in putting Jesus at the center of your story. But of course, we should be relevant. This is not just about the past. Jesus is a present reality, offering us themes of peace, security, acceptance, and love to speak into each other's lives. Ask questions and listen for connections between your stories and the stories in other people's lives. Be respectful as you speak. Listen, ask questions. You're engaging in a conversation together. You're not lecturing. And remember too, a story is not just about the words. It has to be real, lived. Our aim is to be a patient, caring friend who doesn't just talk about church and Jesus, but helps people each day. Peter writes in his first letter, In your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reasons for hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Look at the reason behind what Peter says. He assumes people will question him, and those questions will focus on the hope that we have. When we share our stories, what we were looking for is to do it in a way that prompts people to ask us questions. Living his story, then, is not hidden away, but raises these questions. We want to talk about the extraordinary love for God. But we do it in a world where people struggle and they're in need. Sometimes it can be raw and it can hurt. We have a wonderful story of good news to tell, but we have to live it too. Living Jesus' story is costly and it can be uncomfortable, but there really is no other way. It's here that I will add my story to it. For many years, my grandmother had dementia, and gradually it became worse. I'm not ashamed to say that I would pray for God to take her, to end her suffering. But for a long time, he didn't. And I would sit and wonder why. But a few years ago, I went to a theology lecture about joy in woundedness. Now that sounds like a really strange thing to say. How can there be joy and pain in woundedness? The theologian shared his story of visiting the L'Arche communities and how he found extreme joy in a shared suffering. It was a place where the diverse community had been brought together, a raw, pain-filled place. But together they shared their pain, and from that shared pain they found immense joy. His story helped me to share my story with you today. You see, my grandmother wasn't suffering. In fact, she was really quite happy. It was her family who suffered. But amongst that, like the community in L'Arche that he shared in his story, we did actually find joy. A family that didn't have time to see each other very often. Our lives were filled with children and other commitments. We met together maybe only once or twice a year. But with my grandmother, we all met much more often. We visited her together. We shared our stories. We refound the love that was there from us being together. Our shared pain gave us a shared sense of love. And I have to admit that through some of these times I thought that God wasn't always there for me, for us together. But that lecture that day reminded me that actually he was there with us, and often there with us more than other times I have known in my whole life. I was discovering that life in my story. Since the first Easter day, 2,000 years ago, the disciples of Jesus had been discovering that there is life in the story of Jesus, and that you and I are privileged to share this too. So this week, think about these tips for sharing your story of following Jesus with others. Maybe you could think of a time when you did share your story, or when someone else shared their story with you. How did it make you feel? Was it raw or painful? Or did it bring you joy? Or maybe, like me, it brought both. Also, think of a practical way in which you can help someone this week. But don't forget, you must spend time quietly sitting by yourself with Jesus on your own. How does that make you feel? So next week, you'll join and look at us with how Jesus teaching us, how he communicates with us in our 5th installment of our Lent studies.